fantastic speaker who's come to deliver a talk to us all about cybersecurity and pen testing as well. So Holly, it's a pleasure to have you on board.
Hello.
How are you today anyway?
I'm amazing. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. Even better seeing all of you as well. So I believe we've got some people from the States over as well. So yeah, and we've got a good attendance so far as well. So I propose now that so now Holly has developed a career in cybersecurity and founder of the company Akimbo. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Awesome. And over the years as well, she's worked with different organisations as well and delivered some amazing talks about cybersecurity as well. So she's also a great role model for others to follow as well, and gained a distinction in information security at the Cardiff University back in 2014 as well. So she's worked in a different number of organisations, including Ministry of Defence, SecOne Limited, and Secama as well. And Holly has also been on TV as well. Been on TV as well, including the BBC as well. So, Holly, I hope your introduction has done you proud, and the virtual floor is yours. Everybody else, relax and enjoy and be inspired. Holly, it's over to you now.
I feel like you only told half of the story. I was in fact on TV. I went on Sky News and answered the question, "What is TikTok?"
Cool.
So.
Cool.
It was there for cybersecurity reasons, but that was the opening question. So it's a low bar on TV sometimes. Yeah, I'm going to do a talk about cybersecurity in general, in particular, offensive security. So I'm going to talk about hacking and effectively my day job. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. Please feel free to heckle throughout the talk. If you've got a microphone, feel free to just interject if you would like to, or if you want to ask questions, ask them down in the chat box. It's probably a lot better for me to take questions as I'm going through, comfortable doing that, as opposed to at the end having to go back to content that we covered earlier. There is no big story or big moral from this particular presentation. I'm just going to talk about how ethical hacking works from a professional point of view, and then take any questions that you guys have. I'll also talk about some of the times that cybersecurity maybe goes wrong, or some maybe naive approaches to cybersecurity that a lot of companies have. Best practice is not always best. I'll give you examples to prove that point. But for those who've never seen me before, and don't take that initial introduction as everything you need to know. I would say everything you need to know for this talk is I break into computers and buildings for a living. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about offensive cybersecurity. And the reason I wanted to have this as my introduction is the fact that being an offensive cybersecurity specialist brings along with it a certain degree of bias, and it brings along with it a certain viewpoint about cybersecurity. Certainly very different viewpoint to somebody who maybe is an auditor or maybe works in governance, risk and compliance, those kinds of things. My view about cybersecurity is quite limited in that I pretty much only care whether or not I can hack an organization. I care a lot less about academic vulnerabilities. I care a lot less about vulnerabilities in theory, and I care about whether a vulnerability is exploitable and whether that can be used to demonstrate impact within an organization. That sounds like an obvious thing to say out loud. However, many organizations don't actually treat cybersecurity like that. For example, many organizations have a static policy when it comes to managing cyber risk. For example, they might have a policy that says, we install all updates within 30 days, and that's it. Just all updates within 30 days, no dynamic risk management process. The truth is, not all vulnerabilities are the same. Not only do different vulnerabilities have different levels of risk, but the exploitability of different vulnerabilities is quite significant. We see really good examples of this with things like the WannaCry vulnerability. Different people call that vulnerability different things. You might call it the WannaCry vulnerability, you might call it MS-17010, you might call it Eternal Blue, whatever, the vulnerability that was used by the WannaCry malware. The reason that that vulnerability was such a big deal in many instances was the fact that publicly available exploit code was out there on the internet, was available for download. This reduces the barrier to entry quite significantly. There's a lot of breaches that have been like that. If you want to look at something like the TalkTalk breach in 2015, I'll have to narrow it down. There were several, talking about the time that TalkTalk got hacked by a child. In that breach, that child used a tool called SQL injection. SQL injection is one of the best known vulnerabilities. I'm not going to talk about it much in this presentation, but it is a well-known vulnerability that has been around. It's been documented as an exploit with a fix since Christmas Day of 1998. That's the oldest reference that I know of SQL injection being documented. And a child used it in a major breach of a UK-based ISP using a freely available exploit tool. The exploit tool, part of that being important because it lowers the barrier to entry. It doesn't mean that you have to be a very intelligent, very knowledgeable, very experienced attacker if you can just download a tool and effectively click go. SQL map is one of those kinds of tools. If anyone wants to see it, I can in fact demonstrate it. It's a very easy to use tool. For anyone who thinks, yes, but that's just one side of cybersecurity. Yes, companies that don't care about their security are going to get hit by literal children. It's going to happen, but that doesn't represent the broader cybersecurity risk spectrum, to put it that way. I'll give you another example. In 2016, the Mueller report, this is a source from, if anybody bothered reading the Mueller report, it states in that report that in 2016, the Illinois State Board of Elections was compromised by Russian state intelligence, GU, and the exploit that they used, the vulnerability that they used was SQL injection. So you have children hacking ISPs for fun, and then you have nation state level attackers, all using the same very well-known, very old vulnerability. So cybersecurity, when I talk about it, that's the kind of thing I care about. It's whether an attack can actually be exploited or not. So moving forward from what I do for a living, hacking things, I'm going to talk about what I guess some people within this meeting might refer to as ethical hacking, although within industry, we don't typically refer to it as ethical hacking. As a role, we would call it penetration testing. It would be true, and many people do use the term ethical hacker to refer to themselves, but typically when we're talking about the work that we do, we would use a more specific term like penetration testing or red teaming or vulnerability analysis, depending on the work that we're doing. When I'm talking to the public, when I'm talking to the media, I do tend to use the term ethical hacking just because it's better known, but it's rare to use it actually within industry in my experience. So what is penetration testing, and what is it that I do? Yes, I hack computers, and I mentioned that at the beginning, but how does it work? I wanted to cover my definition of this. Now, reasonable adults will disagree. Oh man, nobody told me that my screen share hadn't worked. Let me try that. Thank you to the chat there for pointing out that Zoom was still waiting for permission. There you go. Hopefully everyone can see my slides now. Yeah, sorry. Zoom was just waiting a little button in the corner saying, are you sure you want to share your screen? There you go. Hopefully everyone can see slides now. The reason I wanted to share my definition was the fact that reasonable adults will disagree with terms. You'll find some variance in the definition of what a pen tester is, some variation in the definition of red teaming. So now you know how I'm going to use that term throughout this conversation. And also it allows me to talk about some of the limitations on certain approaches. So let's start at the beginning for those who don't look at offensive security very frequently. And that would be with the distinction between something like vulnerability scanning and something like penetration testing. And it's worth pointing out that very often when you talk to a penetration tester, they will talk down, very often, not always, but very often talk down about things like vulnerability scanning and things like vulnerability analysis. And that is for good reason, but that doesn't mean that vulnerability scanning is valueless. So first of all, when I'm talking about vulnerability scanning, I'm talking about an automation-led approach to security testing. So this would be typically using an automated tool where you supply a fixed scope, maybe IP addresses or URLs, something like that, and it scans that fixed scope for known vulnerabilities. Most vulnerability scanners are signature-based. There's a few out there that can do actual vulnerability analysis using dynamic scanning engines. It's still surprisingly rare to find those things, but most of them use static signatures for finding vulnerabilities. One of the benefits of vulnerability scanning is that fact that it's entirely automated. This reduces the barrier to entry for security teams in finding vulnerabilities. And also it's very often a fast way of finding issues. If you wanted to know, for example, is your patch management system working? If you've got something like SCCM or something like WSUS and you're pushing out patches to your systems and you want to know, is that working, or has it crashed, or is it failing to deliver updates for some reason? A vulnerability scanner is a good way of finding issues like that. It's also a good way of finding common and default misconfigurations, weaknesses that might be introduced because systems are configured to be compatible as opposed to highly secure, those kinds of things. So vulnerability scanners are good for that. Also on the business side of things, very often they're relatively cheap in comparison to a high amount of penetration testing. So with penetration testing, then the work that I tend to do, what we're talking about here is a human-led security assessment. And there's two restrictions to penetration testing generally. The first is the fact that it is scope restricted, and the second is the fact that it is time limited. So scope restricted, there's a couple of ways in which pen testing is scope restricted, but the first is we are only going to assess the systems that you explicitly give us authorization to assess. Sometimes people get confused by, I don't know, I guess movies or an assumption of how pen testing works as opposed to actually how it works. For example, companies may expect us to just find their systems and perform security assessments of them without them listing them for us. It should be relatively obvious to everybody in this meeting that computer hacking is a crime. Within the UK, we're restricted by the Computer Misuse Act, and the Computer Misuse Act has an aspect in it that says if an action is knowingly unauthorized, so you have knowingly unauthorized access to a computer program or data, that is an offense. So the way that we get around that from a pen testing point of view is we have an authority to test form. How different penetration testing companies handle this is different, but it'll be in the contract or it'll be in the terms and conditions somewhere that grants them that permission. At Akimbo, we literally have a form called an authority to test form, and the company will sign the systems that we allow to assess, and it has terminology on there that says something along the lines of these actions will be considered knowingly authorized in regards to the Computer Misuse Act. I'm not a lawyer, but the legal team write those terms for that reason. We are explicitly being given permission to perform hacking. So it is scope restricted in terms of the fact that we can only assess things that we're allowed to assess. Question from the audience, can I send the slides out? Absolutely, I can send those out, that's no problem. So how else is it restricted? There's only so many things that you can actually authorize us to do. We will still be in some way restricted, even if you give us an authority to test form. For example, I'm not going to kidnap a member of staff and threaten them with physical violence. An actual criminal might. So we'll try in some aspects to make the assessment realistic in that regard, but we will somewhat be limited. Also, it tends to be scope restricted in such that most security assessments, we only use a single technique. This can be a bad thing, and it can be something that we can get around talking to the customer. But generally speaking, a customer would say something like, we're releasing a new version of our website. Please perform, a technical hack against the website and see if there's any weaknesses, thereby restricting us from performing social engineering or performing physical access testing. We can do that stuff and frequently do, but most pen testing is a single technique at a time. That is one of the distinctions with red teaming. I mentioned red teaming earlier, where the adversarial team is determining what technique to use between technical, physical, and social. That's pushing more towards a red team engagement. Also, this time limited aspect, it's on one hand time limited because it's a consultancy service and you're paying people generally per day, but there is an amount of time allotted to that. And again, the longer the assessment, more likely you're pushing towards red teaming. Big difference between pen testing and red teaming, though, in my opinion, the most significant thing is pen testing, we're doing it with the knowledge of the organization. Generally, we're working with the IT team. We'll be discussing with them the way that we're assessing systems, what we're intending to do, and where we have been successful. This is notably distinct from a red team engagement where members of the organization will be aware of the assessment, but broadly speaking, the team wouldn't be. So the help desk, the SOC, the security team wouldn't have knowledge of the assessment going ahead. This is because a penetration test is typically looking for vulnerabilities within a system, whereas a red team is looking to assess an organization's ability to detect and respond to an attack. So that's a big difference. So if I'm trying to hack you undetected, it's probably a red team. If I'm sitting in the IT department hacking things, it's probably a pen test. Some people get a little bit tied up between making the assessment as realistic as possible and kind of leaning really far into, well, what would an actual hacker do? This frustrates me in a couple of ways. One thing being, not all hackers are the same. That's why within industry, we tend to use the generic term threat actor. We wouldn't necessarily even say, cyber criminal or something like that, because if you consider something like a nation state sponsored threat actor, what they're doing within their jurisdiction might not be a crime. It might be entirely sanctioned by their local law enforcement or their local government. So we have nation state backed attackers, we have cyber criminals, as you would expect. And then on the other side, of course, on the far end of the spectrum, we also have bored teenagers with too much time on their hands, or those kinds of things. I did an assessment with a private school, a boarding school, a couple of years ago now. And that was one of the things that they wanted to simulate, was they have students who effectively live at the school for many months of the year. What can somebody do with not necessarily a high degree of skill, but certainly a lot of time on their hands? That was a fun assessment. So if you're leaning towards making the assessment realistic, then that's fine, but you would need to pick a threat actor or a threat profile so that we can simulate or emulate what that kind of attacker would do. Are we trying to be a bored teenager with too much time on their hands, or are we trying to simulate what a nation state group would do? Because the capabilities, the amount of time, the technical attacks within their skill set will be very, very different. So that's all things to bear in mind when it comes to security assessments. When it comes to the assessment itself, like how we're going to approach an organization, many companies think that we'll just come in and we'll start hacking things. And that's fine. Like, I'll have an easy week. If you just release me on your network, I'm going to probably focus on things that I find interesting or cool, or I'm going to maybe test out some of my new techniques or some of my new tools. That's awesome. But one of the things you should be talking to the pen tester about is, what is the aim? What is the result that you would like from this assessment? I'll give you an example of what I'm getting at here. And this would be, if you're looking at a specific risk, such as would a threat actor be able to deploy ransomware on your network? If I'm looking to compromise a network from a ransomware point of view, maybe I would be looking to compromise as many end user devices as possible, and that would be it. Or maybe I'd be looking to compromise backups to prevent a response to a ransomware attack, something like that. And what I'm targeting and how I'm targeting it would be very different. Just a point to note on this, very often when we talk about compromising end user devices, organizations treat that as a very low impact consideration. And they say, well, if you compromise a bunch of end user devices, that wouldn't frustrate us very much, because all of the data, all of the profiles, all of the user accounts are stored on the servers. We could just rebuild the end user devices. I see where that comes from, but it is a naive view. I worked with a company back in 2017 who got hit by ransomware, and they had just short of 8,000 impacted machines. So 8,000 of their machines were infected with, that was the NotPetya breach. And yeah, they absolutely could just rebuild those end user devices. In fact, they had a playbook for doing that. They were able to rebuild up to 30 devices at a time. They had 8,000 to get through. It was a significant impact for that organization. In fact, it took them 10 days to return to being able to operate as a business. So if we're looking at simulating ransomware, we're going to do something like that. If we're looking at something like theft of intellectual property or theft of financial information or personal information or something like that, it's probably going to be quite a lot different. And I'm just going to target a single machine. Very often when we talk, certainly to IT teams, they'll expect us to do something like, following a standard methodology. So, compromise a user account, privilege escalate, compromise a domain administrator account, something like that, an enterprise administrator account. That is something we will generally try and do. Compromising a very highly privileged account is a great way to achieve whatever your goal is. But it doesn't mean that if we're not able to compromise a domain administrator account, we can't show a significant impact. For example, what if I compromise a member of the finance team and I can access payroll information or private information of that regard? So it's worth talking to the tester about what is the bad thing that could occur for your organization to make sure that when we're trying to demonstrate risk within the report, we're accurate to your organizational context. So I want to talk about one of my favorite vulnerabilities. And I'm going to talk about this vulnerability because it leads me into talking about really why so many companies in my experience struggle with preventing effective penetration testing. At some point, whenever I do presentations like this, people always ask, do you ever find a company that you can't break into? Not really. I mean, let's not go down that rabbit hole right now, but not really. And for the most part, that is the situation that many IT teams find themselves in. That okay, put it simply. If I give you a single device, I give you a single laptop, and I say all I want you to do is keep this laptop up to date, that would be very easy. You'd have very little difficulty doing that. Once a day, check the device, install any outstanding updates. But that task becomes very difficult with scale. And if you have 10,000 machines and a distributed workforce and some people who aren't on the network very frequently and those kinds of things, a simple thing like keeping devices up to date becomes pretty difficult. One of the problems about talking with these challenges is people will always try and solve the problem off the cuff. So they'll say, no, even 10,000 devices will be easy because we'd enable automatic updates or something like that. And they try and solve the problem. The truth of the matter is a significant number of organizations do struggle with those fundamental aspects of cybersecurity, such as keeping things up to date. That means that my job is relatively simple in most instances, at least for the first few tests that we have with an organization before they actually start hardening systems. Another thing is there's a certain bias on the defensive side of things. So very often when we talk to defensive teams, they're focused on passwords, patches, and perimeters. So they want strong firewalls, they want strong passwords or multi-factor authentication, that kind of thing. And they want systems to be up to date. And when they've achieved those things, or when they're on the journey to achieving those things, they feel like that's it. Cybersecurity is, done. They feel like they've reached a high level of maturity. And the simple truth of the matter is, machines are insecure by default. If you get a Windows build, a fresh installation of Windows is not highly secure. It's highly compatible. It has many options configured that make it work well, make it interoperate with other systems well, but do not make it secure. This is one of those examples. So link local multicast name resolution is a protocol that most IT teams I talk to have never heard of, and every network pen tester, every infrastructure pen tester I talk to has heard of. So with this, link local multicast name resolution, I won't get into the specifics of how these protocols work, but it's a fallback for DNS. That's what it is. I'll demonstrate through effectively clip art how the communication works and why this leads to effectively a significant vulnerability. But in short, this is a protocol that is enabled by default on Windows systems. And because it can be used for an attack, most frequently it can be used for an interception attack. So it can compromise communications and typically steal credentials. It's a wonderful vulnerability because if you have focused on patches, passwords, and perimeters, this vulnerability will be present. So it's one of the reasons it's one of my favorite vulnerabilities. And I'm going to put hacking with zero effort in here because, as I mentioned earlier with SQL injection and SQL map, with link local multicast name resolution spoofing, there's automated tools that exploit this vulnerability. You can use Metasploit to exploit this, which is typically my preference, or there's also a tool called Responder. There's a couple of different flavors of Responder, but it's a great tool for exploiting this vulnerability as well. It's the kind of tool where you just click go and it does the hacking for you. The way that it works though, and why this is a vulnerability. When a device on the network tries to communicate with another device, typically it would do this using host names. And because it's using host names, it would talk to the DNS server to convert that host name to an IP address. So if you have a script that's running on that device, perhaps to connect to a backup server on a certain cadence, or maybe you have a member of the IT team who's connecting to a network share to access some content or something like that, they're probably going to type a host name in, that machine will connect to the DNS server, and it will convert that to an IP address, and then they'll connect to the target machine. Skipping over some steps here to do with Kerberos, but you get the general idea. So where does this become a problem? It becomes a problem when DNS fails. Now, DNS can fail for a lot of different reasons, as anyone who's ever looked at DNS knows. But the main reason could be, for example, the DNS server is temporarily unavailable because it's rebooting. It could be that the user is not currently on the corporate network. So maybe when I'm in the office, my device connects to the backup server, but right now I'm in Starbucks and therefore it can't connect to the backup server because I'm on a different network. Or it could be simply that IT administrator who's trying to connect to a network share mistypes the address, and that's it. So it mistypes the address when it connects to the DNS server. The DNS server doesn't have the answer for that hostname. What happens then is the interesting thing. When the DNS server fails, Windows machines by default will fail back to using different protocols. One of those protocols is link local multicast name resolution. That is a multicast protocol, believe it or not. It'll also fail back to using NetBIOS name service. NetBIOS is a broadcast protocol in this context. Effectively, what happens is it shouts out to the network and says, I am looking for this target machine. Are any of your devices this machine that I'm looking for? And all that we do as a threat actor is we respond to that request. Now, the question here is, how easy or difficult are the automated penetration testing tools to use? This is a prime example of incredibly easy. Now, understanding the details of the methodology and having the broad understanding of how to impact all different tech stacks and exploit all different kinds of vulnerabilities that I have as a penetration tester, that is difficult. But learning a single vulnerability and how to exploit a single issue is very, very simple. As I said, the tool to exploit this vulnerability is called Responder. You can download it. You can grab it from GitHub, or it's installed by default on tools like Kali, a penetration testing version of Linux. When I say you just click go, it pretty much is that. For Responder, on the command line, you would type the word Responder to run the tool, and then you just give it a network interface. So -I, and then the name of the interface. So on Kali, it's probably going to be -I and then ETH0 for F0. You can obviously capture on the wired connection or the wireless connection separately. That's up to you. That's about it. It really is not a difficult tool at all. It'll work effectively on wireless networks that don't have host isolation enabled, which is many wireless networks. And of course, it'll work on any cabled network that you're plugged into. Like I said, LLMNR is a multicast protocol, so you'll reach as far as the multicast domain, which in most networks is pretty damn far. So the threat actor's machine, our machine, when we're testing, will connect back to the, in this instance, victim's machine, and it'll say, the device you're looking for is me. And then the victim's machine will attempt to connect to the threat actor's machine. Now, what actually happens in this instance when the victim's machine connects to the threat actor's machine depends on what the user is doing. The example that I mentioned was connecting to a file share. So what would happen in that instance by default in a Windows machine is the Windows device would attempt to authenticate to the threat actor's device, and the threat actor would get a cryptographically protected copy of that user's password. You might say hash, it's actually a challenge handshake, but in short, we get a cryptographically protected copy of the user's password. There's a second line on this slide here that's pointing to the file server. What I'm indicating there is there's a relay attack you can do as well. So you can capture that connection and then forward it onto another device. There's some limitations there. The relay attack is only going to work if the connection is an administrator's connection. So they must have administrative access to the target machine, those kinds of things. This is actually a separate vulnerability. We're talking about SMB relay here, but it is worth mentioning. SMB relay is a vulnerability that exists on any machine that has SMB signing disabled or not enforced. All Windows machines by default, other than the domain controller. So again, it's another wonderful vulnerability because it impacts all machines unless the administrator has explicitly hardened that configuration. Both of these issues are actually really easy to fix. You can fix them within group policy. I'll get to that in a second though. So we can either capture credentials or we can capture an administrative session, and instead of having it mount a file share or something like that, we can execute a command as the administrator. Wonderful vulnerability. It's the way to get into a corporate environment, plug a laptop in, and have compromised the whole network within like 30 minutes. Very, very fast. So the tool to use this is called Responder, as I mentioned. Here's a screenshot of it running in Kali to demonstrate what the response would look like from the threat actor's machine. So we literally go into Starbucks or whatever. I should probably point out at this part, I did mention that computer hacking is a crime, right? I definitely got that out there. Not recommending you do this. Your mileage may vary as to what happens if you do commit computer crimes, but it is as simple as running this tool and then waiting. You connect to an insecure wireless network, an open wireless network, or one that you know the password of, or you plug into a network that you have access to, say you're a guest, a visitor, or a contractor at a company, plug in, run the tool, and then wait. When one of these communications that can be intercepted occurs, so a user mistypes an address or a server is temporarily unavailable, you capture data like this. This is a net NTLM version 2 hash. Different hashes have different resistance to brute force attacks. Net NTLM version 2 is not a particularly resilient hash. This is effectively that user's password cryptographically protected. We could then perform an attack against that. It's going to be an offline brute force attack, of course, because we have a copy of it. So we can go back home, go back to our hotel room, whatever, and then we can run an offline brute force attack against that. Offline brute force is wonderful for 2 reasons. The first is it is significantly faster than communicating with the server to determine what the password is. Secondarily, it's not going to lock the user account. Doesn't matter how many password attempts you try, it's not going to lock the user account because what you're doing is breaking the cryptographically protected copy of the password. You're not communicating with the server. So it's a wonderful exploit. Some people might ask, how do we do password cracking? And I see a lot of talk, certainly on places like LinkedIn, about password cracking, and people say, oh, password cracking is a lot faster on a GPU, so you should get some fancy gaming rig, or you should get, a desktop with like 8 graphics cards in it and those kinds of things. That's cool, and you can do that if you want to, but you're going to spend a lot of money on that. The way that I do it is yeet it to the cloud, and both AWS and Azure, I'm sure other cloud providers exist, both AWS and Azure offer GPU optimized instances. This is a P3x16 large running in AWS. These devices are wonderfully powerful for password cracking, but you be warned, if you leave one of these running, they cost $18,000 a month to run. So don't do that. As you will see in a second, you do not need to run it for very long, and it will not cost you very much money. But this screenshot is me cracking a wireless password. So how this has happened is user within wireless range of me has connected to a WPA2 protected network. WPA3 is now available. You should use it. WPA2 protected network, I've captured the handshake. So as the user's device authenticates to the server, I've captured that. Very similar attack to the responder attack that we talked about a second ago, just targeting a different thing. Capture that handshake. I've sent it to this AWS box. This AWS box has got 8 Tesla V100s in it. They are very expensive graphics cards, many thousands of pounds each. It's got 8 of them. And each graphics card is doing 800,000 password attempts a second. So in total, for this kind of hash, this instance is doing 6.5 million password attempts a second. Now, that is a huge number. And you might be thinking for your wireless network, well, it doesn't matter because my wireless network password is completely random and it's 63 characters long. Great. Now think about how organizations like ISPs define passwords. Think of somebody like TalkTalk, for example. Many TalkTalk routers, as an example, most ISPs have some similar vulnerability, but as an example, TalkTalk routers have an 8-character password that is made up of numbers and uppercase letters only. That key space is not very big when you're doing 6.5 million password attempts a second. In my experience, it's going to take 1 or 2 days to crack one of those. It's going to spend some money. You're going to spend some money on AWS if you're doing that, because like I say, it's $18,000 a month, but a couple of £1,000 for a couple of days. If you are cracking different hashes, as I said, different hashes have different resistance to brute force attacks. Here are some examples. So net NTLM version 2 hashes, the ones that I mentioned a second ago that responder captures, 3.1 gigahashes a second. So that's 3,000 million attempts a second. SHA-1 is in there as an example of, I think most people know that SHA-1's not the strongest hash out there anymore. For SHA-1, we're doing 142,000 million attempts a second. NTLM, if you're unfamiliar with NTLM hashes, those are the hashes that Windows devices use to authenticate. So they're stored in the domain controller, and local accounts are stored on the local device itself. So if you compromise a device and have physical access to a device, you can get those. Relatively rare to come across those, but I did include them because, as you can see, they're a relatively weak hash and you get a significant number of password attempts a second against those. In fact, if you were able to compromise an NTLM hash, think of the kinds of passwords that users use: dictionary words with common suffixes, lockdown 2020, winter 2021, those kinds of passwords are very common. And then think that you're getting 680,000 million password attempts a second. You're going to crack all of the hashes relatively easy. But the kind of thing that we're going to come across very commonly, NetNTLM version 1, NetNTLM version 2, and WPA2 keys. They're pretty common and also pretty fast. So my favorite vulnerability, it's dead easy. I've shown you the impact. Download a tool from the internet, you run it, you capture some hashes, you crack the hashes, you compromise some user accounts. It's awesome. But where does that vulnerability come from? Why are so many machines impacted by this? Yes, I stated earlier that the presence of link local multicast name resolution is because it's a default configuration. And in truth, Windows machines by default aren't particularly hardened against attack. Here's a screenshot of our platform running a CIS benchmark against a default Windows device. This is a 20H2 Windows 10 build. Straight out of the box, we've just built it. We've scanned it against the CIS benchmarks. If you're unfamiliar with the CIS benchmarks, they're worth taking a look. The CIS is an organization that releases hardening guidance for an awful lot of systems. Linux installations, Azure, AWS, Windows installations, all different kinds of things. And the CIS benchmark level 1 refers to their general use benchmark. And of course, like I said, this is a Windows 10 box, straight fresh install. And as you can see from that horrendous red health bar, about 42% of the recommended controls are actually installed. They're not particularly hardened. Add on top of that, some of the guidance is sometimes confusing. For example, there is a group policy option to disable link local multicast name resolution. It says words along the lines of disable LLMNO. And when you go into group policy to do that, you may spot that it says in the little dropdown, disabled. It's a bit of a confusing terminology here. You must enable the group policy object that disables LLMNO. So it has to be set to enabled for it to be disabled. So sometimes things like that can catch administrators out if they're not very familiar with these things, or if they don't have anywhere to actively test themselves whether the system is in a secure state or not. Question from the audience, are there any hashes really difficult to crack? Yeah, a whole bunch of them. Bcrypt hashes are generally pretty good. The hashes that macOS use are generally pretty good. Yeah, any modern hashing algorithm, Argon 2, that's a good hashing algorithm. Yeah, truth is organizations like OWASP have got guidance out there on what are considered good hashes. In part, some of the weaknesses with common hashes that we see are not only that the hash is fast to brute force, but it's also going to be things like NTLM hashes aren't salted. Anyone who knows about password cracking and password storage knows that hashes should be salted. So there's a lot of weaknesses there. I'm just kind of giving the overview. But yeah, directly, yeah, there's a whole bunch of hashes that are actually good. So what is my guidance here, really, as we kind of move towards closing out this presentation? Penetration testing is awesome, and you should all buy more penetration testing, says the pen tester. Of course, I'm going to say that. But in fairness, one of the things that I would love to see more organizations making use of is actual hardening guidance. Not necessarily the CIS benchmarks. They're a good starting point. Got a couple of problems with them that I'll talk about in a second. Yeah, hardening systems, it's going to make my job a lot harder. Turning off those default configurations, turning on protection mechanisms like SMB signing. They've been in Windows for decades. They're all well tested. They're easy to roll out. It's just a group policy setting, but many organizations don't pay them enough attention. I did say that I would talk about some of the weaknesses with things like CIS. Not to pick on CIS specifically, it is worth taking a look at, but one of the recommendations from CIS is that password complexity should be enforced. And you'll get this with best practice, where some best practice guidance contradicts itself. So CIS benchmarks say complexity must be enforced. It's a recommendation. Complexity is that thing that you have with your passwords where you have to use an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, a symbol. Microsoft defines complexity as 3 of the 4. It'll also specify a minimum password length. The minimum password length that CIS recommends isn't 8. We'll see what it is in a second. It's 12 or 14, but there's also some issues around passwords, password lengths, password rotation, the use of password complexity, those kinds of things. But just sticking with complexity for a second, CIS recommends that you enforce it. The NCSC and NIST, so we have a UK guidance and a US guidance there, both recommend that you do not enforce it. In fact, the NCSC's guidance, if you check out their post updating your approach, which they wrote in 2018, or published in 2018 rather, is pretty explicit. Do not use complexity, do not enforce complexity. NIST 800-63B has the same guidance, but it's not quite as clearly written. But the NCC is pretty blunt. Do not enforce complexity requirements. So now you have two pieces of best practice that are contradicting each other. The truth is, we don't need to worry about that. Every organization and every individual's threat model is different. The controls available to every organization is different. The context that your organization operates in is different. You do not need to blindly follow the CIS benchmarks. You can use them to inform your hardening of your systems, and you absolutely should. So there's a couple of problems with it, but in general, it's a good starting point. One more thing just on configuration of why sometimes Windows isn't the best from a hardening point of view is many users have weak passwords. This is one of the most common formats for passwords that we come across, a dictionary word and a common suffix. We see leet substitutions as well. That's at signs instead of A's, that kind of thing. But this is a very, very common format. And when we talk to organizations and we say, we can brute force these passwords, organizations very, very often respond, you cannot brute force our accounts. We have an account lockout policy enforced. By default on Windows systems, probably doesn't work the way that you think it does. If within group policy, you enable an account lockout, so say you go in and you set account lockout to 5 or something like that, Active Directory is going to pop up. In fact, I've got a screenshot of it, I think. Yes, there we go. Active Directory, or rather group policy, is going to pop up and it's going to say, because you have set an account lockout threshold of 5, the following are suggested settings. And what we can see here is reset account lockout counter after a defined number of minutes. This is referred to commonly as the observation window, sometimes the lockout counter. It's a number of minutes before the reset, before the password count is reset. So what that means is if you have a threshold set to 5 attempts and the suggested settings enabled, it's not 5 attempts before the password locks, because I can do 4 attempts every half an hour per user account. That's 192 attempts per account per day. It's a lot of attempts, especially when you're looking at passwords like Lockdown 2020. So yeah, you've got to be careful of these things as well. The kind of suggested settings. Sometimes, again, as I mentioned, leaning towards compatibility and lower administrative overhead as opposed to a hardened, high secure system. So something to bear in mind. But yeah, the kind of takeaway as I close out and summarize what I've been talking about here, what I would recommend organizations do to counter many of the common attacks that penetration testers use during engagements is just asset hardening. There's also something to be said about network segmentation. Network segmentation is another thing that we rarely see implemented well, but those kinds of basic principles. So harden systems using something like the CIS benchmarks and restrict data flows. When it comes to network segmentation, very often when I talk to organizations about it, I say, oh, you don't have good network segmentation. And the organization again will respond, our network is well segmented, it is heavily segmented, or words to that effect. What they are typically referring to is something like VLANs. VLANs are generally not a trust boundary. It's not what I mean by network segmentation. So I've kind of added that point just by referring to it here as effective network segmentation. But what we're talking about is restricting data flows. Big part of the methodology is propagating across systems, and anywhere that you can restrict that is going to be useful. If you want to see great examples of organizations having really terrible network segmentation, look at the NotPetya breach from 2017. NotPetya was a piece of malware that spread using a common hacking technique. If anyone has come across the tool Mimikatz, NotPetya used a very, very similar payload to how Mimikatz works to extract plain text credentials from a device, and then it propagated using PSExec. Very, very similar in effect to how the SMB relay attack I mentioned earlier works. It's a different mechanism, but it's very similar in principle. So yeah, harden assets, that's the big thing. So if you want to take one thing away from this, it's going to be passwords, patches, and perimeters are awesome, but that's not all that there is to cybersecurity. And that is pretty much it. That's what I wanted to leave you with. So harden your systems. Pen testing is awesome, but most organizations only do it once a year. And for the rest of the year, one of the things that you can look at is hardening your assets against common and default misconfigurations and enabling those built-in security mechanisms like signing of messages. Got a whole bunch of questions coming through the chat, so I'll take those now and leave you with my closeout slide. What are the key attributes or motivational differences between the various types of threat actors, e.g. script kiddie, nation state, hacktivist, or insider threat? Okay, insider threat is not a type of threat actor. Let's start with that one. So you can break threat actors down in different ways. You could break them down based on capability. A script kiddie is probably going to be less capable than a nation state attacker. And bear in mind as well, nation state attacker could mean many different things. You could have state sponsored, which could be a country is paying a threat group. It could be state backed in terms of a country is supplying a capability, maybe feeding vulnerability information to a threat group. It could be state sanctioned, which could be a criminal group that a state is allowing to operate on foreign soil. Nation state threat actors can be a collection of things. In the same way the script kiddie could be a collection of things. It could be an aspiring criminal who is still learning the ropes and is still very simple in their knowledge, methodologies, capabilities, or it might just be a bored teenager with a whole bunch of time on their hands. Hacktivist, it's going to be politically motivated attacker, an activist that uses technical attacks. But again, insider threat. An insider threat could be, and the one that everybody talks about the most, a disgruntled member of staff, somebody that you have maybe fired, looked over for promotion, those kinds of things. That is one that many people talk about. What people talk about less frequently is things like an insider threat where a member of staff has taken a bribe. Simple thing. I will pay you money if you give me access to your systems. It sounds a little bit movie, I think, and maybe that's why people don't look at it. It's also a very difficult thing to do anything about, which I think is why organizations don't look at it. If you want to see a good example of it, though, AT&T had that for several years between, I think, 2015 and 2020, if I remember correctly. Several members of AT&T's organization were paid to compromise their systems, including disclosing credentials, installing remote access software, and even installing remote access hardware. There is a indictment against them if you want to read the technical details. So yeah, what are the key attributes and motives difference between different kinds of threat actors? Capability being knowledge, tool set, knowledge of vulnerabilities, knowledge of exploitation techniques, knowledge of evasion techniques. Backing in terms of finances, is the person pulling a day job, or are they spending all day hacking you, or are they being paid to hack you? And then also the amount of time that they've got. Once a threat has gained entrance, has compromised the network, what are the key motivations in the decision as to where to go next? Oh, wonderful question. So I would put it to you that most threat actors most threat actors don't do what I like to do, which is cool exploits and interesting things. They will do whatever is the path of least resistance to achieving their goal. This, in my opinion, is the reason that we see such a significant amount of ransomware. If you are a financially motivated attacker, ransomware is low effort. And it's also, these days, relatively low capability required, low barrier to entry for the threat actors. You see that with breaches such as the Travelex breach. The Travelex breach, that was the beginning of 2020, January 2020, or I guess arguably December 31st, 2019. Travelex were compromised and the attackers had a huge level of access to their internal network. What could the attackers do next? They could look to compromise payment card systems. They could look to perform fraud. They could look to steal intellectual property and sell it, or they could drop ransomware. And they dropped ransomware. That might be a reflection of them looking to achieve their goal very quickly, or it might be a reflection of their limited capability. I don't know. Are there any key indicators to realize that a threat has compromised your network? Yes. Read the entirety of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. MITRE ATT&CK framework is one of the frameworks out there that discusses all of the mechanisms that a threat actor might use, from things like network propagation over PS exec, to pretty much everything I've spoken about today. MITRE ATT&CK framework is useful because it enables us a shared vocabulary. So we can talk about techniques using the same terms as each other and have a common definition. But also it's just a big old list of things that threat actors might do in your systems, and therefore a big old list of key indicators. Can you compare that to Deadbolt data security software? No, I'm not familiar with it. What inspired you to develop a career in pen testing? It was an accident. So I'm actually ex-military. I was a communication systems engineer in the military, served for 5.5 years. I wanted to play with satellites. I couldn't afford my own, so I borrowed the military's for a while, and then tangentially moved over to cybersecurity because I was operating secure communication systems in hostile environments. what do you think of starting out with the EJPT course? Junior penetration tester course. There's a lot of different courses out there for pen testing. I think the first recommendation I would give anyone looking at courses, certifications, training on pen testing is if you can first take a look at what area of penetration testing interests you. I've spoken in depth tonight about network pen testing. Actually, my interest, the thing that I find that the most interesting, personally, just an opinion, is actually web application attacks. It happens to be that most of the work that I do is network attacks at the moment. It's just a side effect of where the company's at and the kind of customers that we have. But find the area of cybersecurity that's most interesting to you, be that mobile applications, web applications, infrastructure, cloud, anything like that. And then find a course that's appropriate to that. You'll find some courses, Offensive Security Certified Professional, for example, at OSCP, very network heavy. If you're a web app preferred person, maybe that one's not good for you. I think the only guidance I would say for all of those courses is if you're looking at getting a career in pen testing, you don't necessarily have to spend the money. A lot of these certifications are very expensive. If you want a good example of that, look at any of the SANS certifications. They're very highly rated, but very expensive. But just take a look at the curriculum. What are they following? What are the things that they're recommending? What tools are they using? What methodology are they using? Those kinds of things. A lot of companies, if you have followed through a training course such as the EJPT or the OSCP or something like that, but haven't passed the exam, that wouldn't actually hold you back from getting a job, because they could determine your capability through some other mechanism, like a technical assessment or something like that. And most corporate environments, certainly for end users, are Windows, and you've been talking about AD, Mimikat, Space, etc. Are you predominantly using Windows tools for your pen test, or do you flip between Linux and Windows? I run Linux on a MacBook. I'm actually on a Windows box today, but it doesn't matter. I'm vendor agnostic. I'll use like whatever tool. I don't really care. I spend time on Windows when I'm coding, because we have agents that deploy to Windows machines, so that's beneficial to test software that runs on Windows. But yeah, I use all three. All three for me being Linux, Windows, and macOS. Most of the tooling, it doesn't matter, especially on the web application side of things. It doesn't matter what your base OS is, especially if you look at something like Burp Suite, very, very common tool within the web application space. It's written in Java, it'll run on anything. Also, a lot of the stuff that I do these days is very heavily custom. So I'm probably going to be writing in Python or Rust, and Python will run in anything as well. Are you predominantly using Windows tools for your pen tests? No, if I'm doing a pen test, there's a 97% chance I'm running Linux. Not because you have to, or there's any restriction or anything like that, it's just a personal preference. The main reason that if I'm doing a pen test, I'll be running Linux is just availability of Bash and Python to automate tasks, that's all. You very easily could replace that with PowerShell, as many people do. How did the military impact the way your career developed early on? I didn't have any certifications. I have GCSEs and a master's degree. To explain that, I said that as if it was nothing, and then realized it was a strange thing to say. I joined the military at 17, and when I left the military, then did a master's degree. So in terms of career development, it would, in my opinion, I don't know, can't travel through time. In my opinion, it would have been no different to going to university and getting something like a computer science degree. I spent the amount of time in the military that I would have spent in college and university, and I left with a similar amount of experience. Granted, in different things, computer science would have probably been more programming heavy than my military career, which is very networking heavy. But at this point in my career, it makes no real difference. I spend as much time programming as I do hacking networks. Did it have a great benefit, or was it still a case of breaking into the industry with more certs? It depends entirely on roles that you're going for. For me, no, I didn't leave the military and then get a whole bunch of professional certifications. I did get a master's degree. That was a personal goal, not a career goal as such. I do now have a huge number of professional certifications. I grab them all the time. CompTIA, Pentest Plus, SEC Plus, Cloud Plus, Net Plus, Air Plus, CREST certified CCT app. I'm an AWS machine learning specialist. I personally like getting professional certifications. It's not a requirement for many organizations. It's not a requirement when I hire people. So yeah, was it a great benefit to my career? I can't say it wasn't, because I got a job in pen testing, but there's definitely other routes in. Common question. Do you prefer computer hacking, physical security, or social engineering? What do you see as the biggest risk to companies? Every organization's context and threat model is different, so there's no such thing as a biggest risk to a company. If you only concentrate on one of those areas, you'll just get hacked by the other. Personal preference, interesting one for you. I don't enjoy doing physical access testing. I don't enjoy breaking into buildings. That might surprise people because it's one of those aspects of the job that is highly romanticized. People think it's very cool. I enjoy having done it. I don't enjoy doing it. It's a difficult thing to explain to somebody, but when I'm doing a physical access assessment, I'm not having fun in doing my hobby. I'm there for a job. I'm trying to demonstrate risk to an organization. I am working. It's a very different mental state than urban exploration or something like that. For me, at the moment, thing I enjoy the most is, like I say, web application hacking. I love a good cross-site scripting vulnerability. But truth is, I spend most of my day hacking networks. Are there any software simulators available where we can model our network and then subject it to various attacks similar to pen testing? No, you'll never automate a attack chain like a pen test very easily, nor should you necessarily try to. Pen testing is just one mechanism for security assessment. You absolutely can automate attacks, and that's what vulnerability scanners are. We use a huge degree of automation, and we're moving into using machine learning for offensive security and those kinds of things with our continuous security testing service. But you shouldn't necessarily try and model what a pen tester is doing. What you should try and determine in the most efficient way possible is whether a vulnerability or a risk condition exists. So if you want to see if your machines are vulnerable, for example, to MS-17010, the WannaCry vulnerability, you shouldn't pay a pen tester to do that. You should use automation. You very easily could log into all of your assets and determine their patch status. And then if they are missing that patch, they're vulnerable. That's it. Very, very easy. Pen testing shouldn't be seen as, and certainly red teaming shouldn't. Very often red teaming is treated as though it is like the pinnacle of security testing and it is better than all of the kinds of security tests. It is not. It offers you a different benefit. So it depends on what your goal is. Does OSCP cover cloud sufficiently? No. I can build on that, but bluntly, no. Is there a course that covers Azure, AWS, GCS hacking? No, there isn't for the most part. Difficult thing to explain. There is training resources out there for compromising cloud environments. Things like cloud.flaws is a good example of that from, it's a little bit older now, but it's a good example of that kind of thing. The truth is the way that I learned to compromise Azure and AWS environments is the same way that you learn to compromise network environments is get a high level of understanding of how they're supposed to work. I spend a huge amount of time building things in AWS. That's how I understand how all of the different tech stacks work and those kinds of things. You wouldn't necessarily need a course to teach you how to hack that stuff. If you wanted to start somewhere and you were just like, well, there's 1,000 vulnerabilities, where do I begin? There is a CIS benchmark for both Azure and AWS. So take a look through what the common weaknesses are in those regards. For those who've maybe still looking at cloud as though it's magic computers instead of just actual computers in somebody else's data center, the way that I think of cloud security assessments is 3 different things. Cloud hosted, like a website that's hosted within the cloud, broadly speaking, no different to any other application assessment. Cloud infrastructure, so hacking within a VPC or something like that, very little difference to hacking within an on-prem network if I'm hacking things like AWS EC2. The big differences come with the fact that there is a cloud configuration portal. The big differences are the fact that it's probably going to be IAM instead of Active Directory or something like that on AWS, less so on Azure. And then things like the metadata service and those kinds of things. But yeah, start learning how the technologies work. Look at something like the AWS Cloud Practitioner as a foothold into cloud security. For career changes, would you recommend getting a degree in computing or certifications would do? Honestly, whichever works for you. So some organizations do still terribly mandate degrees. One of the reasons that I got my master's degree is so that if HR say, do you have a degree? I can tick the box. It's an awful lot of effort to go to get a degree to just go, yes, in an interview, you absolutely can have a completely fulfilled career without having a degree. As many people will shout from the ceiling that is a possibility. I got one because it made my life easier. Would certifications do? Certifications are great as a shorthand for demonstrating a capability. My CV, as you can imagine, is very heavily swung towards hacking things and pen testing. I've got an awful lot of experience in AWS, though. One of the ways that I demonstrated that was get AWS certifications. So it's just shorthand. It's going to help you with getting roles and things like that. Also, another benefit of certifications that is sometimes overlooked is it just adds structure to your learning. If you want to learn how a system works, if you want to learn how Azure works and the things that it offers, following through Azure certification paths is one way to get structure to that. You absolutely could do it without the certification, but just whatever works for you. I do loads of certifications because I like them and my company pays for them. Do you look at IoT devices when pen testing? Yes. Anything that is within the scope, we will try and compromise. IoT devices, if I'm attacking OT, so if I'm targeting an airport or a building management system or within the marine space or something like that, IoT devices are probably going to feature very heavily within that assignment. If I'm hacking just a normal network, IoT is probably not going to give me anything that interesting. We do quite frequently on pen tests compromise CCTV systems. It's one of the things that we mention on the big list of other things that we hacked into. One thing that I do love hacking, though, which is often an IoT system, but not always, door access control systems. Those are wonderful. If you can demonstrate to a company that you can unlock all of their doors, or you can print your own door access cards, that is a hilarious thing. I was working with a FTSE 250 about 18 months ago, and I compromised their door access control system. And one of the things that we pointed out in the report was we could just disable their access control system, which would mean that effectively all of the doors of all of their offices, and they have 700 offices, would just be unlocked. And that would be a difficult thing to manage if you didn't have a really good playbook for what to do. So yeah, IoT within OT environments is huge. Outside of that, less so. Could you hack a police car to open the doors or disable the engine? I'm under an NDA for all of my knowledge in regards to police systems, so I couldn't discuss that at all. Car hacking in general, though, is well established. There's been all kinds of vulnerabilities in car systems. There are some specific vulnerabilities to do with ECUs and CAN buses and those kinds of things. That's fair. But also cars in general just have computers on them. Most transport these days have lots of computers on them. There's a whole bunch of computers on trains, for example. So without commenting specifically on vulnerabilities, a computer is a computer. Oh, fun thing to do if you own a car that was made within the last 20 years, look in the manual of your car. Look generally at the very back of the manual for the software licenses section. I have no idea what my current car is running, but I used to have a Mercedes. And if I remember correctly, my Mercedes had, is it Drop Bear SSH? It had some very common SSH server installed on the car somewhere on one of its devices. Wonderful thing about open source software is very often its presence is declared through things like having to publish the license that it's used under, those kinds of things. So you're going to see the weird things that cars have inside of them. Your own manufacturer's manual is a good place to look. While a business might, specifically on disabling the engine of cars, that has been done before, by the way. Many years ago, Charlie hacked a Jeep. If you just type Charlie hacked a Jeep into Google, you'll probably find everything you need in that area. While a business might have a dedicated SOC in their IT team, are there any ways that even with a first-line worker could add value to the department regarding security? Yeah, all over the place. So, first-line IT staff, support staff, you're going to interact with a lot of systems. You're going to interact with a lot of users, and you're going to be the person that people go to from a security point of view. Very often when we talk about social engineering and coercing staff members, people think that social engineering is like just sending phishing emails, and it's not at all. One of the things that we're going to try is calling the help desk up and trying to convince the help desk into resetting a password for us or something like that. We're going to target IT members of staff as well. Very often, I don't know if it's like Dunning-Kruger or what, but very often IT team members of staff feel that their level of security understanding is much higher than everybody else's, and therefore they actually disregard some security guidance because of that, or maybe are less aware of it. We're going to target IT team members of staff, and you are as vulnerable to coercion as anyone else. You won't fall for the same things, but you're not impervious to coercion. Also, just dumb things like staff members might have machines that are infected with malware that maybe there hasn't been an alert generated because the antivirus has been disabled or something like that. You're more likely to spot those things. Very often breaches are, well, not very often, but it's not unheard of for breaches to be detected by IT team members looking through logs, trying to debug why something is broken and finding features of an attack, even if they don't work in a SOC. If you are hiring someone without a computing degree, what skill set and knowledge should that person have? I like how you worded this as if it's a hypothetical, as if I haven't spent like the last 10 years hiring people like this. What knowledge and skill set should the person have? One, relevant to the role. So I do hire pen testers. I also hire offensive software developers. The kinds of things we would look for in those instances are very different. But I should caveat this with, some companies' recruitment practices are awful. This cannot therefore be general advice, but it's how I would hire somebody. I would try and find some way of determining whether their knowledge and skill set is related to the work that we would want them to do. If we're hiring a pen tester, I'm going to ask you questions about your knowledge of both discovering vulnerabilities and remediating vulnerabilities. It's no good if you're the best hacker in the world if you can't tell anyone how to fix the vulnerabilities. I'm going to focus on that. We're going to focus on things like practical knowledge, practical exploitation skills. So have you tried Hack the Box? Have you run vulnerable machines within VMware using VulnHub? Those kinds of things. Have you done certifications? Can you talk me through the process of exploiting SQL injection? Those kinds of things. Generally speaking, the way that I run recruitment is the same for a junior as it is a principal. I'm going to ask questions like, can you explain SQL injection to me? Just the answer that we would expect would be different. A junior would probably be aware that the vulnerability is a member of the OWASP top 10, probably aware of simple detection mechanisms and should be aware of the remediation advice. A principal is probably going to talk to me about how to artisanally craft payloads, and that's awesome. Same question, different demonstrable experience. What are the most dominant attribute of an effective hacker? Skills, resources, patience, motivation, or persona? A diverse team will get you much further than a single capability. So I wouldn't say one attribute dominates over any other. In the same sense that when we're hiring people, we're not looking for a specific and set profile. We're looking for somebody whose skills and capabilities complement the current team. Yeah, don't think because you can learn how to program in Rust that you will get a job everywhere. If you hack CCTV, could you wipe the data out? Probably not, because the data wouldn't be stored on the CCTV camera. It would be stored on the, word escapes me, word for the device that the CCTV camera talks to. It's like a NAS, but for CCTV devices. Could you wipe it out? Yes.
Sorry, Holly. Sorry to. I want to
Yeah,
just elaborate on the question because I saw on the a social media post some woman showed video from her CCTV camera that a guy he was posing as a flower delivery, and then he attacked her in her house, but she managed to fight him off. She called the police, and apparently the recording from the house camera was wiped out after that. So I'm trying to figure out, like, was this guy's skill enough to do so, or is it probable story, or?
Yes. So I'll add some context then. The way that home CCTV systems works very different to how commercial CCTV systems typically work. Most home CCTV systems do store the data on the camera, probably on an SD card. Those kinds of IoT devices are rarely very well written, in my experience. Embedded systems used within the home have many problems. So from a technical point of view, do I believe that somebody could hack a CCTV and erase the data without leaving a trace? Yes, in the way that you're asking the question, but one of the things in regards to without leaving a trace is, if you hacked the CCTV we have in the office here and deleted the last 24 hours of data, you have done what the question asks, wipe the data out without leaving a trace, but it can be pretty obvious when there's 24 hours worth of data missing. So there's always going to be something there that could indicate a compromise. But yes, can CCTV systems be compromised and that leads to data loss? Yes, it happens very often. So that's the home situation. If you want to see the flip side of just like a really extreme example, in 2008, there was a cyber attack against an oil pipeline where the attackers disabled the cameras that were monitoring the oil pipeline. They then blew the pipeline up. And one of the aspects of that attack was the CCTV was disabled, so footage of exactly how it happened wasn't available. So yes, there's several prior examples of that. Also, it depends what wipe the data means. If you guess the password that we use on our CCTV controller in this office, you can just press the erase button. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a software exploit. It could just be we used CCTV1234 and you guessed the password. Another thing to add to that, in many instances, certainly of home IoT devices, there is very often vendor installed backdoors. What I mean by that is things like maintenance accounts that might not be present within like the user interface, but might be set. I've had that with network attached storage before. One of my kind of vulnerabilities that I found in a product that wasn't previously found before, trying to avoid using like the term zero day or anything there. A previously unknown vulnerability that I discovered in a NAS was that kind of thing, a vendor installed backdoor. What are the key attributes of a target for a hacker? Depends on the thing that the hacker is going for. Key attributes of a target for a nation state sponsored attacker are going to be very different to a financially motivated attacker. You know, if you look at something like the Illinois State Board of Elections compromise that I mentioned from 2016, they're very likely in that instance looking just for personal information of voters. If you look at something like the Travelex breach, which I also mentioned, they're just looking to dump ransomware. That the depth of the compromise, the tools and techniques that they use are going to be very different. Something to add though on the detectability part of that question. So, you know, what would an attacker target? Would it be value, control effectiveness, detectability? Sometimes those things are very difficult to determine. How would a remote attacker determine the responsive capability of an organization without triggering that response and therefore being detected? It's an interesting challenge space for attackers. And one of the things that we have seen with prior breaches is a threat group might drop on a network previously known malware, not necessarily like, you know, really basic malware, but something that's previously been seen, something that has IOCs available for it, that kind of thing, might plant that malware on a network to determine how that organization responds to that malware. If you plant, you know, previously seen malware on a network and they don't do anything and they don't detect it and they, you know, they don't spot it, that might be useful information for that threat group. In the very least, it might prevent them from using their most advanced tools because they don't want to use them and then be detected. Certainly not within like a later forensics investigation or something like that. If your detection capability is very, very poor, the threat group's probably not going to spend that much time doing anything fancy. Were you required to inform the vendor of the vulnerability found? I'm not a lawyer, but it's my understanding that I've got no requirement legally to inform anyone of anything in almost every instance. The way that this comes about is important. So if I'm doing a penetration test for a company and we find a vulnerability in a system that they have deployed, there might be some contractual restrictions about the ways that we can talk about that and the information that we share. Anytime an instance like that comes up where maybe I'm under an NDA, but I feel the need to speak to a vendor or something like that, it's two ways that we handle it. The first is I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to talk to the legal team. And secondarily, just talk to the customer about it. It was many years ago now. It was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but during a penetration test for a company, I found 4 vulnerabilities that had not previously been seen before. And that meant that there was 4 significant vulnerabilities within their report where the recommendation was there is no fix available for this vulnerability. There's still things the company can do. They can disable that system. They can put a firewall in front of it to block access. They can segment it on the network. There's still actions that they can take, but it's not like change this configuration option or install this patch. So in those instances, giving that report to that customer would be of less value than explaining to that customer, we should speak to the vendor about this. Vendor response can differ greatly. And I've had some very good and very bad responses from vendors previously. And my experiences are not necessarily extreme. You'll find a lot of pen testers out there who have had much worse experiences dealing with vendors than I have. Just statistically, there's a lot of pen testers in the world. The fastest remediation I've had from a customer, from a vendor, sorry, was about 90 minutes. That was Team Password Manager. I found a privilege escalation vulnerability in their tool, and they fixed it like very, very quickly. They pushed an emergency patch and an announcement. It was great. The longest I've personally had a vendor take to remediate a vulnerability was 93 days between disclosure and the actual patch being available. I've also, in one instance, technically had like a negative amount of time for a response and disclosed a vulnerability to, I think it was Netgear, and they immediately released a patch. The only thing that I can think that must have been was they were aware of the vulnerability and they were planning to release the fix. Many companies have a certain cadence for their security updates, like Microsoft famously has Patch Tuesday. I presume they had like scheduled it to come out, and because it had been detected in the wild, so to speak, you know, a third party, me, had found this vulnerability, they released it immediately. So I presume it was ready to go and they were just maybe going through testing or waiting for a schedule or something. So that was a cool one as well.